So, hello. It seems that we are live. I am Liza Debevec, and I write Sharing Secrets and Other Useful Stuff, and also another Substack called Scattered Crumbs and Tangled Tales. And I'm here today with Liza Bolin of the Flucking Flourishing. And Lisa also writes another Substack that she can tell you all about it. Yeah, Lisa.
Yeah, I write Northern Notes, which is kind of my experiences living in the Nordic region of the world, having moved from Australia 8 years ago.
Wonderful. And today we're going to be talking about the trouble with assumptions. I posted an article on my Substack yesterday about this. And then I thought, what a great opportunity for me to try and go live with this and to invite Lisa, who's really experienced in doing live. Well, you're doing videos, you're doing lives,
I'm a pro.
And so I thought, I don't have to do this alone. I can ask for help. And I think this is where, the conversation around the assumptions can even start. It's like, sometimes we make assumptions that if we ask for help, people will say no, or they'll be too busy, or all kinds of things. And what's the impact of that on us?
It's interesting because I think people like to be asked to help, to help others. So, maybe the stories about ourselves get in the way of doing the things that we're asking. Because I think most people, like if I asked you to help me, you would go out of your way to try and make it work, wouldn't you?
Sure. And I think it's really interesting because for me, it's easier to help others. I think I have this idea of, I don't know, like maybe it was part of my upbringing, being independent, doing things by myself. And so asking, and then maybe a fear of rejection or sort of like if someone says no. So I think that this is also, where the assumptions come in. A lot of times we assume things about others because of limiting beliefs that we have about ourselves. And that is in a way the topic of the. Sorry, I realize I'm moving and I'm getting out of the video. So yeah, I budge a lot when I'm on camera. And this is a smaller space. Yeah, but so I'm curious to know what is something that for you is an everyday example of where you feel like you made an assumption about someone or a situation, and then that impacted you in a way that you found interesting.
I have thought about this and your article quite a lot because I don't think I do. I don't think I often make assumptions. And I mean, I'm kind of thinking maybe I assume. I don't know. It's a tricky one, and your question is interesting. I mean, maybe I have assumed that people know about something when they don't, or I kind of operate from the idea of don't assume. Like when I live in a country and I speak Swedish, and I don't sound like most people don't know where I come from. They think I'm from here. And I usually tell them that I don't have Swedish as my native language. It's actually English because otherwise I think, well, they will assume that I understand every single thing. And if I say, what does that mean? Then it might be awkward. So I kind of just clear the air at the start. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know that there is a situation, a particular situation where I've thought or assumed. I'm kind of, I think having moved country, I have a tendency to kind of diffuse the not assuming, if you know what I mean. So I'm trying.
So you come with the list and say, here I'm Lisa, and don't assume the following things about
exactly.
me. Right?
Yeah, don't so assume I know everything.
Well, I think that's helpful. Like I come with a manual of things that you shouldn't assume about me. I think I think it's really, it's really great that way. And I think it's very interesting because I was thinking one of the things that I'm noticing is there's 6 people who already joined us. And I had made an assumption that on my first live, other than my mother who received an email and joined and maybe watching. So hello, that nobody else would join. Like I was making that
Yeah.
assumption. And then, what's the impact of that assumption on me is that, like maybe I'm thinking, oh, I don't need to work as hard because nobody's going to show up, or maybe it's where, like it can affect
Mm,
me in all kinds of ways. And I think that
okay.
that's the part that I love about this work that I've been learning around assumptions on my leadership program,
Mm,
about clearing them even with yourself, not necessarily with
mm,
others, but writing it down. Like, for example, you're talking to you go into a situation, and before that you have a lot of assumptions of what it's going to be like, and so you write it down, and then you write it down. It's like, I'm assuming the following, and the impact of that assumption on me is this.
mm.
What would happen if I didn't have that assumption, and how would I then interact with the people differently?
Yeah, and I have a question. For you, what's the difference between an assumption and expectation?
Mm,
Because, like, I don't usually have expectations, and I'm happily surprised very, very often,
mm.
because I go into situations and I kind of, I don't know, maybe I've been living in Finland a long time where, the bar's low and anything above that is amazing. Happiest nation in the world for the whole 8 years I've been living here. Um, and, yeah, I wonder.
That's a good question. I was thinking
Mm,
about, so I was actually not thinking about that in that way, because I was trying to explain to people who asked me about this that assumptions, or sharing or clearing assumptions with others, is not the same as giving feedback to
no.
people, right? Because I think that's an important distinction. But in terms of expectations, I guess I think there is a difference between us. Sometimes maybe we will use the two words as interchangeable,
Mm,
but it doesn't necessarily mean the same. I may have assumptions about a certain place, but I think it's like, I will have expectations that the restaurant, if I have a reservation, that there will be a table ready for me or whatever. Or my expectation is that if I book a ticket, that I will have a seat on the plane, which we know
mm.
doesn't necessarily
Yeah.
always work, right? Right. But the assumption is more like the way I learned it, and we had to practice it in our leadership program. And it was fascinating because for a week we were going around, we had to clear an assumption with each participant, one
Mm,
assumption. And what was interesting is that at the beginning of the week, I had certain assumptions about certain people, like maybe, like often, like if somebody's not paying attention to something or is not interested, then I'm thinking, oh, maybe I'm making an assumption they're arrogant, or they're not interested, or they are something. And then that maybe impacts me how I interact with them, because then I may go into people pleaser mode. Like if I feel like they're not interested in me, like I'm trying to make myself more interesting, or I completely detach and I'm like, well, I'm not going to bother here,
mhm,
because the assumption I'm making is that the other person is not
mm,
interested in engaging, right? And as the week progressed, I had not cleared all the assumptions, but by the end of the week, a lot of the stuff that I had written down as the thing I was going to clear with people had disappeared, because we had so many meaningful and deep conversations, and we engaged in all kinds of activities that challenged us in different ways, that meant that those assumptions were cleared. And I
mm,
realized, oh, it came from my insecurity. It had nothing to do with what the other person was doing.
mm,
And same when people cleared their assumptions with me, I was like, oh, whoa, where did that come from? And maybe other assumptions where several people said the same thing to me. And then I was thinking, oh, maybe I do. So it is, it gave me some feedback in the sense, oh, when I do that, I guess that's what people perceive when my intention is different. So, you know, do I need to do anything about it? Or do I need to just be very clear, like you said, upfront with, these are the things you should not assume about me, right?
mm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting. I'm kind of thinking now in the work situations I've been in, and I think because I've been on the I mean, I am living currently in this place. They assume so much. They assume you know everyone, that you've, lived here your whole life, that you know intimately all of these things. And of course, no one here does that, but they all kind of assume. And there are just daily conversations with people where I'm asking questions. I am asking how things work, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, that's right." So like I'm a constant reminder to them to not assume things. And I mean, in a workplace, I work, I do all sorts of strange, amazing things, but I'm currently teaching biology in Swedish, not my subject at all. Don't ask me how I landed there. But I mean, I tell people I am not a biology teacher and English is not my first language. So they don't assume that I know everything about biology.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like now it's become this thing that I say because like I don't want them to assume. I don't want them to assume that I know everything because I feel like I'm a beginner. And so yeah, it's fascinating. I think that has had a huge impact on my kind of assumption meter. Like I don't assume. I don't assume that there are things that necessarily that people know things that the should is gone from my vocabulary. I don't use should anymore. Like I
And
don't.
do you think
Yeah.
that's because of living abroad and because basically everything is so different that you can't assume anything, because if you assume, it's like, it's ridiculous. So it's almost like if we are in contexts that are at least appear familiar to us, there's more danger to assume things because, like in a couple, if you've been with someone for a long time, you assume that they know certain things about you, and yet that is not necessarily the case. And I mentioned in my article this thing from Brene Brown's book, I think it's called Rising Strong.
Nothing strong. Yeah.
Where she talks about going to swim with her husband in this lake, and they were both lifeguards when they were young. And she has this whole story about yes, Lily, we can see your message. Just to say, like, we see the comments.
We see the comments, but
I'm a little bit like deer in a caught in the light head, so not yet able to respond to the comments, but we'll get there. And so she assumes that when her husband is not saying anything, and because so she's got this whole story in her head, and she calls it not making assumptions, but she says the stories I make in my head is that you don't like me in my swimsuit anymore, that I have cellulite or whatever. And like, she's got this whole thing, and then they swim, he doesn't say anything, and then in the end it turns out he was worried about safety because of the speedboats on the lake, right? So nothing to do with.
No.
So when she shares it with him in the end, it becomes clear, and it actually then allows them to connect and talk.
Yeah.
But if you walk away with your assumption in silence,
and you're not clear,
I think, and then resentment can build, and you're like adding one layer. It's like brick and you build a castle from your assumptions.
Yeah,
and
or
the
a
other
whole
person
novel.
has no idea what the wall between you is. When it's kind of like a wall of assumptions, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've seen memes like that where there are a couple sitting on a couch and he's like looking off into the distance and she's thinking, oh, he's thinking about, that hot girl he works with, and he's just thinking about football.
Yeah.
And I mean, I live with one of those. I live with someone who, whatever he's thinking about, it's football, or I don't know. I don't think you think, oh, he's curious. So it'll be like, oh, I wonder what year in World War II this happened and this brought him. Like, it'll be something so obscure. It's never, ever the hot chick up the road. That just doesn't even occur to him. It is that. I think it's important, especially in relationships, that you learn to know your partner. I mean, even with friends too. I mean, you can assume maybe even in long-term friendships where you don't connect very often, that they might have seen particular things or experienced things that you have, but you're not connecting often enough to kind of know that. There are definitely lots of situations where that can happen, and it could erode a friendship, perhaps.
Exactly. And I think that one of the things that I find, for me, it's like if I'm assuming certain things, I will not reach out, perhaps, because I'll feel like, oh, these people are too busy. I don't have kids. I'm currently single, so maybe I have more free time. And I'm assuming that the people who are in relationships, they don't have time, or that, or they prefer to hang out with people with kids. And for sure, sometimes it could be easier for them. And some of the assumptions can actually be close to truth. I think that also has to be said. but unless you've cleared them, right? So you
Mm.
can then sort of like think that, and then I don't reach out, and then I don't reach out, and I don't reach out, and then and then maybe they think, oh, she never reaches out. I'm also not going to reach out because or like whatever,
Yeah.
like, or her life is glamorous. Like when I lived, and traveled a lot, maybe people thought I didn't have time. So like, and then you sort of like go past each other. It's sort of like you miss each other, and that's the part that I think I'm most interested in how, if we don't make these assumptions, or if we make assumptions but then clear them, how that allows us or gives us an opportunity to connect better.
Yeah. It's an enrichment of a relationship, I guess, if being aware of it. The fact that, you realize, oh, I am assuming this, and maybe it's better like to speak it and clear it and move on, I guess. Build those relationships rather than going away with a silence that kind
Yeah.
of can be detrimental
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. Right. Because it eats you up alive. It's not like you may be
Mm,
silent, but it's
mm.
not like these words or thoughts have left you. They
It's
find a
inside
place
you. Yeah.
inside your
Yeah.
body or your mind. Actually, I feel
Yeah,
like they probably find a place in the body, because we
Mm,
do carry, I think, resentment in body in some
definitely.
ways. And so
Definitely.
then, yeah, it's just
Mm,
it can, I mean, it can maybe even eat you up alive, in the sense,
mm,
if it's really like heavy assumption. So I think
mm.
that's, yeah.
I say a thing, and I have said it for years. Don't assume, because it makes an ass out of you and me.
Yes, I've heard
And
that. I've heard that.
yeah,
Yeah.
and being an English teacher, I find it amusing, but it's kind of something that I've carried with me for a really long time, because it can go completely wrong. Um, and so maybe that has kind of shaped the way I go about in the world, that I just don't assume, that people know, that people have the knowledge, that, and it doesn't hurt to check
Yeah.
as well. Like it takes minimal effort and can save you the whole making an ass out of you and me.
Yeah, and I'm curious about this minimal effort, because I'm thinking also that some people maybe believe that this is a scary endeavor
Mm,
to check. Like, like some people will be afraid to ask. Like I said earlier, like if you're really scared of rejection, and I think one of
mm,
the comments on the post was, somebody was talking about rejection sensitivity dysphoria, and then that, if you have rejection sensitivity
mm,
dysphoria, then you can possibly be really worried about, being rejected. And so you don't, right? And so you're making your assumptions, but you never clear them out of fear of
mm,
being rejected.
mm.
So, what are some ways that we could recommend, or that you would recommend? What are some things you think would work for people to clear assumptions in a way that feels less threatening? Uh,
I don't know. I mean, I'm not a therapist, and I don't
no,
know.
I understand, but
Yeah, yeah. Like,
as a human who doesn't assume.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, you kind of have to have a beginner's mind, don't you? Like, I feel like being curious is a really important aspect of yourself to lean into. If you're not a curious person, you can build that curiosity, start asking those questions. And I think the more curious you are, the less assumptions you have, because there are always so many questions. So you're not you become this person who questions rather than assumes. And that shift towards it, I think, to having more curiosity, is about being open to things being a bit awkward sometimes. And humor can work in that you can laugh at yourself, if you assume something and it's wrong, in an awkward situation. I'd also ask the question of, what assumptions about yourself are you having, that, oh, I can't say this because you're making an assumption that it's going to all end badly. Like, I guess it's the personal assumptions too that we can kind of challenge, be curious about, question, and move past, clear
Mm.
them.
Yeah, and this kind of, and I just want to note that Chidra said that I think the expression
Yeah.
ass out of The assume is
Yeah.
the ass out of you and me is from this movie. The
Very
Odd
possibly.
Couple.
I'm going to go down the rabbit hole now,
Yeah.
and I'm going to check
Okay.
that because I
Yeah.
like my sources.
Yeah.
Very
So thank you,
Yeah,
Jupiter,
thank
for
you.
joining and for telling us that. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, when you said about checking whether your assumption is right, or even about yourself, is this brings me to that Byron Katie work, the work, right, as it's called, and this question that where she says, "Do I, what's the thought that I believe, and is it true? And how do I know that it is true? And what if the opposite was true?"
Yeah.
But what I think the biggest question for me is then, who would I be without this thought,
Yeah.
right? If I didn't believe this assumption about me
Yeah.
or about someone else,
Mm.
who am I without
Mm.
that?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's I guess and not sometimes I lose words because I am at that point in my life. You're encouraging curiosity by, I mean, you have this framework and it's really useful. If you're not used to questioning, then it's such a beautiful place to start, and it's gentle and it's caring, and you're meeting yourself with loving kindness, really, which is so important in any process, any kind of work that we're doing on ourselves, that we're realizing we're not assuming that that we have to know everything. We're
Yep.
actually opening up and being more curious and knowing that mistakes aren't mistakes. They're opportunities to, find new ways of thinking and doing and being. I love Byron Katie's work. I think it's just fantastic. And those
Yeah, I agree. I find her uh uh I've discovered her a while ago, but I think there was a point in my life where I thought she was a little bit too woo-woo for me. And
Yeah.
now I really like, I listen to her and I'm just like, oh, who would I be without this thought?
Mm,
And it just makes the whole difference about
mm,
how I feel about things that have happened to me, that things that I do. I think it's really powerful. Yeah, I wanted to also uh, mention, because I just read, just before we went on, I read an article or post on Substack by Philippa Perry, who writes this wonderful advice column thing where people write in, and she wrote a post this morning that it was like, oh, it's like she just added or developed. Oh, and Claire Venus is here.
okay.
Hi, Claire. So that Philippa talks about, what if we're wrong, and, like being wrong and right and making
Mm,
assumptions and how that gets in the way. And then the ability to admit that we've been wrong. Like, when you make an assumption and it was completely wrong, that part about not digging your heels in and,
Byron Katie.
Byron Katie. Yeah. Byron, like the poet, and
Yeah.
Katie, yeah. And it's called The Work. If you Google The Work, and it's amazing because it's in all these languages also. But this thing about going back, being right, being wrong, and it's okay to say I was wrong, right? And it n- nobody really died. I mean, maybe people. I don't know. I can't say for sure
No,
that people didn't
but in
die for
most
being wrong.
interactions,
But
yeah.
but let's say that in general we don't die from being wrong, and I think that that's a really important exercise. So if anyone hasn't subscribed to Philippa's Substack, also Philippa Perry, I really recommend that. Yeah, I thought we said we'll do it for about half an hour, so we have 6 more minutes. I mean, there's
Oh,
no time limit. We could go
yeah,
on
I don't
forever,
know.
but we don't know
I just
how interested
hopped on
people
with
are.
you.
So, if anyone has any questions, please write them in the message and we'll read them out. But in the meantime, I also want to show, like, I don't know if you can see this book here that I have, The Four Agreements. This is the book that I had to read as part of the leadership program. And I really liked that, inspired my thinking around the assumptions. Is part about, first of all, be impeccable with your words. So don't gossip, don't say things you don't know are true. Just, don't go. And that's the first agreement. The second one is don't take things personally. And I think that links really well with the assumption stuff. Because when we take things personally, then we can quickly make assumptions about other people's behavior. Like, oh, he's behaving like this because of something I said or the way I was, or because he or she doesn't like me, something like that, right? And what I found really powerful there, and it's kind of like goes a little bit further from what we're talking about, but this thing that when we take certain things personally, and I don't mean when people are toxic or really mean or if it's an abusive relationship. I don't want, I want to caveat that uh there are situations in which things that are said could have been meant personally. But in general, when somebody says something mean and it lands with us, it's often that there's a limiting self-belief that kind of like meets. And so because we already believe that there's something wrong with us or that we're somehow deficient, when that person says something, that kind of like, it's like a magnet, and then we believe it, and then it's sort of
And
like,
you also kind of find the things that reinforce the ideas you have about yourself.
yeah,
If not being curious and open and kind of meeting things with, well, they don't mean that personally because maybe there's a whole lot of other stuff going on in their life. So, yeah, we can collect those things and draw them to ourselves. And then it just reinforces those assumptions, I guess, too. So it's like you're kind of wanting to release that, as, and the questions help maybe in those 4 contracts when you reminding
yeah.
yourself.
Yeah,
Mm.
and then the final one of the 4 agreements is also that do your best, do whatever you can. And then some days your best can be, some days you'll maybe fuck up completely, and other days
Exactly.
you'll be
Because
you'll
we're
be better.
human.
But then, yeah, right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Lily, I think is saying that okay, I'm seeing here that all truths are subjective and therefore ultimately there is no right or wrong about how we assume or see something. It's just that we experience the world differently from behind our own lenses.
Mm.
Yeah, sure, there is. And I think that, like every story could be told from a very different angle, or every experience can be told from a very different angle by 2 people who were in the same experience. But I guess that with the assumptions, one of the things is we assume what other people are thinking or doing without checking with them. So that is our experience of them. But we could also ask them how they are experiencing this. So what's happening for you right now, without assuming that this is what's happening because that's how I perceive it. I guess that's what I would say.
Mm. And I guess we were also talking in the, with the idea that sometimes you can be wrong, like as in, there's something that you've said or done that is the wrong way of doing it or whatever. Like I think it was in that, maybe not necessarily a thinking and assuming of something or someone as right or wrong. I interpreted it as when you like something specific wrong. Um,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't.
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm seeing Lily is commenting on a long-term friendships or relationships where people evolve and maybe we're stuck in the ideas that we have
Mm,
about the person from before. And
yeah.
even in family relations, right?
Mm,
One of the things I recently listened to, there was a podcast episode, We Can Do Hard Things, about the roles that are assigned to people in families. Like everybody plays a certain role in the family, and there's sort of like a number of roles that different people can play in a family. And so even if you do a lot of work and then you evolve, then your family may still see you as the same person you were when you were a child. So if you were always a rebel and a troublemaker in the family, and the other person was the responsible one, you fill
mm,
that role, and then how you meet the other person is through this number of assumptions that you
mm.
have uh, about that person, even though that person may have, like done a lot of therapy work, has grown up, become way more
Or just
responsible, right?
change because that's what we do. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because it's also about the stories people tell. They stick to those old stories. And I had a recent experience of that where my dad, he again repeated this story when I saw him recently. And I said, I think it's time we change that story. I
Mm,
said it to him because
how
he
powerful.
was, yeah, it really was. I'm 51 years old and he was telling a story of something I said when I was 16.
Yeah.
When I was 16, I said, I'm never having children. I have 2 children. How did I know what I wanted when I was 16? Do I not have the, capacity to change? It's like
Yeah.
my life has changed. And I said it straight out. I said, I think it's time we change that story. And I think it landed. I think it really landed with him. So,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I think that there's power there, and also if we notice that someone's assuming things about us,
Mm,
or if we are assuming that someone's assuming something
mm,
about us, we can say, "Are you assuming something? Is there something that
yeah,
we should talk about?" I think that really the thing is yeah, to have conversations, and I think it's all
yeah.
about it's all about having conversations. But of course,
Mm,
it depends also on cultures
mm.
and patterns that you've developed over time. And
Language.
if you're yeah,
I mean, you and I both know we both live in countries where when we're living in countries that it's not our native language, and that
yeah,
does have an impact on how you can express yourself. There's cultural stuff that's woven in that as well as how
yeah,
you go about it, and yeah, it is interesting. I think it's allowed me to be more curious and more open
yeah,
and listen more because I'm often in the situation where I maybe am not as quick or I need to take time to formulate what to say if we're having like if there's some kind of conversation around that. So you end up listening more and perhaps that's not a bad thing in terms of assumptions. You kind of have to be I don't know. I feel like I've become more open in how that I don't assume.
yeah. I'm
Yeah.
maybe not as evolved as you are. Uh,
Not
I feel like
evolved,
I
but
no, but what I would say is like for me it's interesting. So I've lived outside my own language
Mm,
for for probably 20, so I'm 51 like you, and I've lived outside my country for about 20, last 15 years, but also before that for a number of years in languages, and I had worked in English, I had worked in contexts where French was spoken more, and so none of these are my language, right? And so most of my relationships, actually, most of my romantic relationships have not been in my mother tongue. And
mm,
so, and they were in French or they were in English, but it was, even though I'm pretty fluent in both languages, there will be miscommunication,
mm,
right? And yeah, and then cultural also differences. But what I think is very interesting is that probably under stress, I would say, assumptions come up more. And I think that you and I were chatting about this, how that if you're fully present,
mm,
and I think by being present in your body and really sort of grounded, then
mm,
you're less easily sort of shaken, and therefore maybe you don't jump into assumptions. Whereas if you're in a moment in a stressful situation, then that can sort of maybe push you towards assumptions, or not being as curious or not being as open because
mm.
you're sort of like dysregulated.
Yeah, totally. I agree with that. I'm a mindfulness teacher,
Yeah.
and it's a daily practice to be more at home in my body, to be there and present, and I really think, I mean, there's that connection between being kind to yourself, and that greeting yourself with loving kindness. It does mean it leads to you being more loving and having kindness and feelings of generosity to everybody else,
Yeah.
even if they're being an ass.
Yeah. Right.
Uh,
Right.
yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Because you can, it doesn't mean that you let these people trample over you. You can still have your boundaries, but you can have space
Yeah.
to
And
give love.
Kitty has
Yeah.
a beautiful point here.
Yeah.
As I notice that there are assumptions about how and when people feel confident when what it looks like on the surface doesn't align with what people feel inside. And that is exactly true.
Yeah.
You can be, I mean, I started rock singing at 45 years old, and I honestly thought the first gig I ever did, I thought I was going to throw up on everyone. But people didn't know, they just assumed that I'd done this my whole life, and meanwhile, I was totally, like, shitting myself and did some pretty anxious cleaning beforehand, but that is a really good point. We can really assume what others what others are feeling, and they might look confident but are absolutely shit scared on the inside.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking even back, like I remember in primary school for some reason I was often asked to recite poetry in front of the whole school, and I remember this one moment where I had to go and perform in the sort of in the hall, like we had a kind of auditorium space, and then I had to stand there and then recite a poem. And I remember behind the scenes before I went on to speak, my hand was like literally like, I don't know, like I was trembling. But then I went there and I spoke, and people were like, "Oh, you're so confident." And I was like you said, like shitting myself on the
Yeah.
inside, right? And I think that this there's an element of stage fright is good also. It sort of like
Yeah.
means that you care, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
also that there's, like very powerful speakers, very important leaders. I mean, recently I think Jacinda Ardern's book is about has
Yeah.
I haven't read it, but from the conversations I've heard, she talks about having imposter syndrome, and Michelle Obama talks about it. Like they're very successful, very powerful women out there. If I just think about women, but men as well, who will be nervous and
what do you assume? They're just gliding in there. Like, look
right.
at them. And I mean, maybe sometimes they are, but
Yeah.
it mean it doesn't mean they don't have that incredible, like, fear or all of the things that come up when you're about to put yourself out there. So
Yeah. And I think that's where the assumptions also, like in terms of, I've always thought, I often find myself thinking that people who have a lot of money and can afford to do things, don't have financial worries, that somehow their life is much easier. Because when I did have a lot of money, for a while, my life was easier than when I'm thinking about, oh, this rent is expensive, right? So there is an element to that. Like, money can buy you certain things, right? But it doesn't buy you happiness as such. And I, when I coach, and I was in coaching program, often coaching people, who were students like me, and some of them were much better off than I was when we were in the program, And then when we pair up and we barter coach, we practice with each other, stuff that came up from people who I thought, well, they have no worry in the world. They're like jet setting around. And I'm like, they're just, they have similar worries, or sometimes their imposter syndrome is way more out of hand than mine, And I'm like, it's such a lesson in humility, I think. Right?
And brings us all back to the fact that we're all human, that we all have different capacities at different times. We expand, we contract, we worry, we move forward, we take a step backwards.
Yeah.
All of those things.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's maybe that's a beautiful note on which we can maybe end our live.
Your first live.
My very first live. I am no longer a Substack live virgin. So, yeah. Well, thank you to everyone who joined, and thank you, Liza, for agreeing to do this with me. It felt really great doing it together.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for everyone. Thank you to everyone who joined again. Yes, and I think that's it, right? I think that I just press a button that says end.
Press the button. Bye.
And that's it. Bye, everyone. Thank you.